There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being useful only in your absence, a man whose skill an entire army desperately needs, and whose company that same army could not bear to keep. This is the story of a warrior abandoned on a deserted island for 10 long years, left behind, not out of malice exactly, but out of a kind of practical and unbearable convenience, and forgotten so completely that when his own people finally came looking for him again, it was not out of guilt and not out of remorse, but because a prophecy had just informed them that they could not win their war without him. Tonight we return once more to the long war this channel has already told in full, to follow a man whose story runs alongside it from its very first year to nearly its last, and who carried through every one of those 10 lonely years both an unbearable wound and an unbeatable weapon, and never once in all that time managed to fully separate the two. This is the story of Philoctetes, and it begins, fittingly enough, with an act of kindness so great that it would end up costing him almost everything. To understand how Philoctetes came to possess the single weapon that would eventually make him indispensable to the entire Greek war effort, we must go back, briefly, to a story this channel has already told. The long and sorrowful end of Heracles, greatest of all the Greek heroes, whose death by the poisoned robe of the centaur Nessus this channel has already followed in full. You will recall that Heracles, dying in unbearable agony from a poison even his own legendary strength could not overcome, chose the manner of his own end, climbing to the summit of Mount Oeta and building his own funeral pyre with his own hands, and asking, finally, that someone light it, so that his suffering might end, and the divine spark within him might rise free of his ruined mortal body at last. But no one among the gathered mourners could bring themselves to actually strike the flame, however much they understood it to be an act of mercy rather than of murder, until a young man named Philoctetes, moved by pity for the great hero's suffering, finally agreed to do what no one else present could bring himself to do, and set the pyre alight himself. Heracles, grateful beyond measure for this single act of courage and compassion in his final hour, made Philoctetes a gift before the flames finally took him. His own bow, and the quiver of arrows that went with it, each arrowhead dipped, this channel has already described, in the venom of the Hydra, poison so potent that no wound it inflicted could ever be healed by any ordinary medicine. It was, without question, one of the most valuable weapons in the whole of the Greek world, capable of felling almost any enemy, mortal or monstrous, with a single well-placed shot. And Philoctetes carried it afterward as both a treasured inheritance and a solemn responsibility, the physical proof that he alone, among all the mourners gathered on that mountainside, had possessed the courage to grant a dying hero the mercy he had asked for. It is worth pausing on this origin, because it tells us plainly, before anything else in his own story unfolds, exactly what kind of man Philoctetes actually was, not a warrior famous for conquest or for cunning, but a man defined, from his very first appearance in these old tales, by a willingness to do the hard and compassionate thing that everyone else around him had shrunk from doing. When the great war against Troy was finally called, Philoctetes, like every other Greek king and prince bound by the old oath sworn to Helen's husband, joined the fleet gathering at the port of Aulis, sailing east with his bow and his poisoned arrows toward a siege that no one yet suspected would last 10 long years. But he never actually reached the plains of Troy at all, at least not for a very long while, for on the way there, the fleet stopped at a small island. Some tellings say Cries, others say Tenedos, to make sacrifice at a sacred and long-forgotten shrine, and it was there that disaster found him. He was bitten, the old tellings say, by a serpent guarding the sacred altar, some versions suggesting it was punishment for a wrong entirely unrelated to his own conduct, perhaps even connected to his knowledge of where Heracles' own bones lay buried, a secret the gods did not wish shared too freely. Whatever the precise cause, the wound itself, inflicted on his foot, refused from that very day forward to heal by any ordinary means. It festered instead, and worsened, and began to give off a smell so foul that the men around him could barely stand to remain near his tent, and the pain of it, unrelenting and apparently permanent, caused Philoctetes to cry out again and again, in an agony so constant and so disruptive that it began to interfere with the sacred rites and sacrifices the whole fleet needed to perform in order to secure favorable winds and favorable omens for the long voyage still ahead of them. Consider, for a moment, the particular cruelty folded into that detail. Philoctetes was not merely suffering. His suffering had become, in the eyes of his own fellow soldiers, an active liability, a wound that offended the gods by its very presence at the altar, a cry of pain, loud enough to spoil the sacred silence, a sacrifice required, a smell foul enough to make grown warriors flinch and turn away from a comrade they had sailed to war beside. His pain, in other words, had stopped being simply his own private burden to bear, and had become, in the practical calculation of an army eager to reach Troy and be done with the whole business of war as quickly as possible, an obstacle standing directly between them and the favorable omens they needed. And so the Greek commanders, Odysseus chief among them by most of the old tellings, made a decision that the whole rest of Philoctetes' story would circle back to again and again. They did not kill him, which would at least have been an honest and final cruelty. They abandoned him, instead, quietly, while he slept, leaving him behind, on the deserted island of Lemnos with nothing but his own festering wound, the bow and arrows Heracles had once given him, and whatever meager supplies the fleet's departing conscience allowed them to justify leaving at his side. When he woke, the ships were already gone, sailing on toward Troy without him. And Philoctetes found himself alone on an empty island, wounded and abandoned by the very army he had sailed to serve, with no company at all, except the weapon a dying hero had once trusted into his hands, as a mark of the one true kindness he had shown when everyone else present had failed to. Imagine, for a moment, the particular texture of those first days alone, before the long habit of solitude had a chance to settle into something almost bearable. He would have woken that first morning to an empty shore, the fleet already vanished over the horizon, and understood, with a slow and sickening clarity, exactly what had been done to him. Not an accident of war, not a tragedy inflicted by any enemy, but a deliberate and considered choice made by his own comrades while he slept, weighed and decided upon by men who had shared his fire and his rations only the night before. There is a particular species of grief, reserved for betrayal by the people closest to us, distinct from the grief of any ordinary loss, and Philoctetes was given the whole of it at once, on an empty beach, with a wound already burning in his foot, and no one left to even complain to. He survived there for 10 long years. It is worth sitting with the sheer scale of that number for a moment, because the old poets clearly meant for us to feel the full and crushing weight of it, rather than simply pass over it as a plot detail on the way to the story's later and more dramatic turns. 10 years is the entire length of the siege of Troy that this channel has already told you about. in full, the whole span of Achilles' rage and Hector's death, and every other episode of that long war, all of it unfolding on the plains outside a foreign city, while a single abandoned man survived alone on an empty island, hunting whatever wild game he could bring down with Heracles' own unerring bow, his wound never once healing, his only company the sound of his own voice echoing back at him off empty rocks, and whatever patience he could still manage to summon against a solitude that would have broken most men within a single season, let alone 10 unbroken years of it. It is worth pausing, too, on the peculiar and quietly devastating irony sitting at the very center of his long exile. Philoctetes carried, throughout every single one of those 10 lonely years, one of the single most valuable weapons in the entire Greek world. A bow that could win battles, that had already, in Heracles' own hands, helped conquer monsters no ordinary spear could touch. And it did him no good at all where he actually was. It could bring down birds and small game to keep him alive, and little else, stranded as he was on an island with no war to fight, and no enemy worth the arrows he carried. His most valuable possession, the very gift that would eventually make him indispensable to an entire army's survival, sat idle in his hands for a full decade, useless for anything beyond the barest subsistence, while the men who had abandoned him fought and bled and died beneath the walls of a city he could not even see from his own shore. Back at Troy, the war ground on exactly as this channel has already described, through the death of Achilles, through the contest for his armor and the tragedy of Ajax that this channel has just finished telling, and through year after year of grinding stalemate against walls that would not fall. And it was in the midst of that stalemate, with victory seeming no closer than it had 10 years earlier, that the Greek commanders finally learned something that changed everything about the abandoned man they had left behind on Lemnos so long ago. They captured a Trojan seer named Lemnos, a son of King Priam himself, gifted with the same kind of true prophecy that had cursed his own sister Cassandra to speak truths no one would ever believe. And from this captured seer, under interrogation, the Greeks learned a series of conditions that had to be met before Troy could ever actually fall. Prophecies this channel has touched on before in describing the war's final and most cunning turns. Among these conditions was one that must have struck the assembled Greek commanders with a particular and uncomfortable shock. Troy could not be taken, the prophecy said, without the bow of Heracles. And the bow of Heracles was in the hands of the very man they had abandoned, screaming and forgotten, on a deserted island a full decade earlier. It is worth sitting for a long moment with the shape of what this discovery actually demanded of the Greek leadership, because it is a genuinely uncomfortable reckoning, and the old poets who told this story clearly meant it to feel that way. The army that needed Philoctetes now was, in every meaningful sense, the very same army that had left him to rot alone for 10 years. His agony and inconvenience they had simply sailed away from, rather than continued to endure. And now they needed him again, not out of guilt, and not out of any late remorse for what they had done to him, but purely because a prophecy had just made his continued absence a direct obstacle to their own victory. Odysseus himself, the very architect of Philoctetes' original abandonment by most tellings, was sent, along with Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles. This channel has already introduced in the story of his father's own youth, to sail back to Lemnos and somehow persuade the man they had betrayed to return and fight beside them once more. Odysseus, true to the same cunning that had already won him Achilles' armor and cost Ajax his sanity and his life, did not intend to approach this reunion honestly. He devised a plan built entirely on deception, instructing young Neoptolemus to win Philoctetes' trust through an elaborate lie, claiming a false grievance of his own against the Greek commanders, so that the wounded and abandoned man, hearing a fellow victim of the same army's betrayal, might be more easily persuaded to hand over his precious bow, or to be lured aboard a ship bound, ostensibly, for home rather than for the war that had already cost him so much. It was, in every sense, exactly the kind of solution Odysseus had always favored across this entire long war. Cleverness deployed in place of honest confrontation, a problem solved through careful manipulation rather than through the harder and more vulnerable work of simply admitting a wrong and asking forgiveness for it. And here the story turns, at its very center, on the same tension this channel has just finished tracing through the tragedy of Ajax, the old and unresolved argument between cunning and honesty, between the hero who wins through careful deception, and the hero who cannot bring himself to lie even when lying would plainly serve his own cause. For Neoptolemus, young and still largely untested in the harder compromises that 10 years of war had long since worn into men like Odysseus, found himself increasingly unable to carry out the deception he had been sent to perform. As he spent time with Philoctetes, listening to the wounded man's genuine grief and his genuine and entirely justified fury at the army that had abandoned him, something in the young man's own conscience rebelled against continuing the lie any further. He was Achilles' son, after all, and whatever else Achilles had been across the whole of this long war, this channel has never once shown him capable of the kind of patient, calculated deception that came so naturally to Odysseus. Neoptolemus, in the end, broke from the plan entirely and told Philoctetes the plain and uncomfortable truth, that he had been sent to trick him, that the ship waiting to carry him away was not bound for home at all, but back to the very war and the very army that had left him to rot, and that the whole elaborate scheme had been Odysseus's design from the very beginning. There is something worth noticing, too, in exactly how Neoptolemus's conscience finally broke, because it did not happen all at once in a single dramatic reversal, but slowly worn down across days of listening to a man's genuine and unhurried grief, rather than the brief, tactical account Odysseus had prepared him to expect. Lies are easiest to tell about strangers, or about abstractions, and hardest to sustain in the face of another person's specific and particular suffering, described in its own actual detail, rather than summarized from a safe distance. Neoptolemus had been sent to manage a problem. What he found instead was a man, proud, wounded, lonely, in a way that 10 years alone, with only his own voice for company, had made almost unbearable to witness up close. And the longer he sat with that man, rather than simply performing a role in front of him, the less possible the original plan became to carry out with a clean conscience. It is worth setting this beside his father's own story, which this channel has already told in full. Achilles, too, was a young man capable of great and sudden rage, but also, in the end, capable of the same kind of unexpected mercy that broke his fury toward Priam in the older king's own tent. Whatever else Neoptolemus inherited from his father, it seems he inherited this as well. A temper that ran hot, but a conscience that, once fully engaged, could not simply be argued back into comfortable silence. Philoctetes, hearing this confession, reacted with exactly the fury and the betrayal the story had been building toward across its whole long telling. to have survived 10 years of abandonment only to discover that the men who finally returned for him had come not to apologize and not to make amends, but simply to deceive him one final time into serving a cause that had already cost him everything, was almost more than his own long-suffering endurance could bear. He refused, flatly and completely, to go anywhere near Troy or the army that had left him for dead, and it seemed, for a long stretch of the story, that the whole prophecy and the whole war's hope of ever actually ending might founder entirely on the simple and understandable fury of one abandoned and betrayed man who had finally, after 10 years, run entirely out of patience for being used. It took, in the end, something beyond either Odysseus's cunning or Neoptolemus's belated honesty to finally resolve the standoff. Heracles himself, the very hero whose dying gift had started this whole long chain of events, appeared, by most of the old tellings, in a vision or a divine intervention, descending from the halls where his own once mortal spirit now rested among the gods, and spoke directly to Philoctetes, urging him, with the authority of the very man who had trusted him with the bow in the first place, to set aside his understandable anger and sail for Troy after all. Heracles promised him something the Greek army itself had never once managed to offer across the whole of his long exile: that at Troy his terrible and unending wound would finally be healed by the army's own skilled physicians, and that in using the bow at last, for the purpose it had always been destined for, he would win glory to match the suffering that had carried him this far. And Philoctetes, hearing this from the one voice in the whole story he had never once had reason to distrust, finally agreed. He sailed at last for Troy, ending 10 years of solitary exile in a single voyage, and there, exactly as the vision had promised him, his festering and unhealable wound was finally treated and cured by the army's own physicians, the sons of the great healer Asclepius, closing a decade of unbroken suffering in a matter of days, once he had finally been given the medical care that had been available all along to every other Greek soldier at Troy except the one man they had left behind before he could ever receive it. And in the fighting that followed, Philoctetes did exactly what the prophecy had promised he would, drawing Heracles' own bow and loosing one of the hydra-poisoned arrows that had waited unused through 10 idle years on a forgotten island. He struck down Paris himself, the very Trojan prince whose choice of a golden apple had set this entire war in motion, and whose own earlier arrow, guided by Apollo, had already ended Achilles' life. The war that had begun with one man's careless choice was finally, fittingly, brought a decisive step closer to its end by the arrow of a man that same war's own leadership had once so carelessly chosen to abandon. And so we return, at the end, to the question this long and quietly bitter story was built to ask. What do we actually owe the people whose usefulness we have discarded once their presence has become, for whatever reason, inconvenient to us? The Greek army did not return for Philoctetes because they had finally reckoned honestly with what they had done to him. They returned because a prophecy made his continued absence a problem they could no longer afford to ignore. And even then, their first instinct was not honest apology, but further deception. A plan Odysseus, master of exactly this kind of clever expedients across the whole of this long war, assumed would work exactly as smoothly as all his other schemes always had. It took a young man barely old enough to have earned his own reputation yet, refusing to carry a lie any further, simply because it would have been convenient to do so, to finally break that pattern and offer Philoctetes the one thing 10 years of silence and abandonment had never once given him. The truth, however unwelcome, spoken plainly by someone who could have simply kept lying and gained more by it. Rest now. Let the old island of Lemnos fall quiet again. At last, its long decade of solitary waiting finally over, and somewhere, far across the water, let an old wound, healed at last, carry no more weight than the ordinary scars every long and difficult story eventually leaves behind.